I'm Sarah Fenske, and this is the 314. Every episode, we sit down with St. Louisans who know what makes this place tick. Together, we explore why things are the way they are and how we can make them better. Last month, Alan Greenblatt quit his job. The veteran journalist had a prestigious position as editor of Governing, but he chafed at the magazine's owner's unwillingness to publish stories that might upset President Donald Trump. And rather than let them block his story about the administration's abuse of the First Amendment, he resigned. Alan Greenblatt lives in St. Louis, a place where there aren't too many journalism jobs with a national profile. He knew he was taking a big risk by quitting, and so it was interesting to hear his thoughts on why he thought it was worth it and what he wishes the national media understood about places like Missouri. After our conversation, Ryan Krull joins us for the closer with the latest on a high-profile racially charged incident in South County. But first, Alan Greenblatt, welcome.
Oh, good to be with you.
So you first started at Governing about 25 years ago. Tell us about this magazine. What was the animating idea?
Well, Governing started about 40 years ago. There was a publication that still exists called Congressional Quarterly that, as the name suggests, mainly covered Congress. It was a Washington publication. And back in the 80s, when Ronald Reagan was president, he was talking a lot about devolving power out to the states. And then one of the editors there, a man named Peter Harkness, had the idea, maybe we should cover states. And so he actually was the founder of Governing, which over the years became, very well-regarded publication, mainly read by people who are in state and local government, members of city councils, state legislatures, but it was always read by other people who were just interested because there really are not that many outlets that pay attention to states, cities, and counties. Newspapers will pay attention to their own state, their own city, but as a group, they're not covered very, very much at all.
So it wasn't a giant publication, but it had influence.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It was, like I said, it was well regarded. It would always get these kind of joke references like the Rolling Stone of State of the State speeches, things like that. It was, but, we try not to be too super wonky, but yeah, it was kind of a niche publication in that way. Like I said, people are more interested in national politics. I mean, you look at what's covered now, it's not just under President Trump, but he's emblematic of how nationalized our politics have become. And there's less coverage even of the states where people live and of their own city halls. Often there are major cities that don't have a city hall reporter left.
Yeah, no, we see it all around us. But so you're there at Governing, and you came and went. You were at NPR, the mothership, for a few years there. But you ultimately came back to Governing, and you ended up becoming its editor-in-chief. When did that happen?
Well, I returned to Governing in 2014. I was working for NPR and I was writing for the website. And NPR was moving more, putting some of the resources that had gone into building up the website into podcasts of all things. And so I was still going to have a job there, but it's a long story. But anyway, I wasn't going to have the kind of editorial freedom that I enjoyed or the coverage area that I had enjoyed. So I went back to Governing. Because it's, as journalism now, it's a diminished profession. There are a lot fewer jobs, and there's certainly fewer jobs where you could do serious-minded work, where you can at least have enough time to try to get things right. A lot of reporters now have to rewrite other people's stories or even people's social media posts 5, 6, 7, 8 times a day. And at Governing, we started as a monthly. It became a web-only publication for a while. Has a print publication again. But anyway, we had enough time to try to talk to enough people to really get a sense of what was going on. I had come back in 2014 and I became editor 2 years ago. My predecessor retired and I was asked to take it over.
So this was a magazine you loved. Hearing you talk about it, I understand why you loved it, but it didn't take long into your editorship for there to be some warning signs. And I'm talking about warning signs vis-a-vis Trump. With journalism, it's either going to be warning signs about budgets or it's going to be warning signs about coverage. These were coverage warning signs. What kind of messages were you getting from your owners?
Well, it was pretty blunt, really. We had a new executive who started about a year ago who had the title Chief Content Officer. So she oversaw us, and there was another publication called Government Technology and a couple of state specific publications. And she bluntly stated in a meeting that we shouldn't write negative articles that could draw the attention of the Trump White House and have them shut us down. And it was really a shocking statement to hear. And I had already by that time told my staff that Trump was primarily not our story as a federal official. We were covering state and local governments, but of course, what the president does, and certainly what this president does, affects state and local governments because Medicaid is a shared federal state program, disaster assistance. He's made changes in a lot of ways that the federal government interacts with states and of course, has sent National Guard into cities. So we couldn't ignore him or not cover him at all. And, we were seeing in our culture at large, not just in media, but business groups and universities and so forth, really kowtowing to him. And I had told my staff we weren't going to do that as journalists, our job was to serve our readers and try to present the truth as we best understood it, including being negative sometimes about people in power and what they were trying to accomplish. I said we'd be fair to him and give him credit where due, but hold his feet to the fire. And this was contradicted by upper management's point of view. And so there were stories that we ran that would lead to notes from above that criticize our choice for running these pieces.
And these were stories where you were, as you say, you were trying to cover him in a fair-minded way, but they were critical. That's what would draw the notes.
That's right. That's right. And not just of Trump, but there was sort of a fear of controversy in general.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that when she first said this, that you didn't want to try to draw attention to the publication so that Trump would shut it down. So this wasn't really a fear of advertisers. It wasn't a fear of readers getting upset. Like, she was genuinely afraid that Trump would want to shut down Governing Magazine?
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like the kind of publication he'd read.
Well, I did, in his first term, I wrote a story about his administration's outreach to counties. And he was unusual. Most presidents don't pay much attention to counties, and he had a very active program. He had state days where they'd invite every county elected official to the White House to meet with cabinet secretaries. And they'd usually get 100 county officials from each state to come in. And they really, Obama, when he was president, reached out to big city mayors to try to push his agenda in areas he couldn't get through Congress. And Trump found common cause with counties. And so we wrote about this. I wrote about it. And one of the county commissioners I interviewed later had a meeting with Trump at the White House and had that article signed by him. So
Nice. And so he was at least aware
and
of your work.
the White House Communications Office loved that story and actually had a poster version of our cover hanging in the White House press shop for some short period of time back in, I think it was 2018.
Okay.
So it's not that we were a complete unknown a la Bob Dylan, but yeah, that was partly why I stayed my tongue. There's obviously a desire not to jump in and say to your boss, like, what are you saying? But it just seemed fantastical. I mean, clearly Trump has gone after media companies in this term. He's either sued or been sued by the AP, the New York Times, ABC, CBS, etc. So it's not completely fanciful, but yeah, the idea that he would attack Governing, which is a pretty small magazine, the idea that we'd be on either his radar or the radar of people who want to score points by bringing things to his attention was pretty fanciful. And the type of stuff we did we were not the New Republic. We were not the Nation. We were not habitually criticizing either Trump or any other Republican.
Yeah. I mean, again, you're there to cover what's happening in the States. This is when you were covering him, it was because it impacted the state. So you're getting this message. And I should mention your corporate owner, this is a company called eRepublic.
That's right.
This was not Congressional Quarterly at this point that owned you guys.
Right. So Congressional Quarterly was owned by what was then the St. Petersburg Times in Florida, now the Tampa Bay Times. being a newspaper, they were hemorrhaging money. So back in 2009, they sold CQ Press, which was a political science, still is a political science textbook publisher. Then they sold CQ to The Economist, and they sold governing to this company called eRepublic, which, as I said, has some other government publications, government technology. At the time, it had others as well. So, yeah, it was not their primary business. eRepublic's primary business is events, whether live events or webinars. They're trying to get, they wouldn't say quite this bluntly, but they're trying to get government officials in the same room with people who want to sell things to government. I mean, that's basically what's happening. It's all framed as education and very much is that way, but that's how they make money. And so, there's always been some, as with many other publications with other business interests, there's always some sensitivity about who you're angering with your editorial product. But it had not really been as big an issue as it became.
And it feels like maybe what's happening with smaller media outlets is we see what's happened to larger media outlets. You see the New York Times get sued for $1 billion. It becomes more maybe self-censorship than actual censorship. That nobody wants to attract negative attention, so you just kind of try to keep your head low. That's kind of what they wanted you to do?
Well, that's exactly right. And that's partly what bothered me. I mean, I didn't like it in general, but I especially didn't like that dynamic. And that's why I went public with this. I resigned, I guess we should say. I wrote an article sort of at the peak of the free speech moment we were having around Charlie Kirk's assassination and Jimmy Kimmel being suspended. I wrote an article defending free speech and the First Amendment and was told by my boss that we should not publish this piece. And it was a bit on the nose to say we can't write an article defending free speech. But I'd already made clear to her that I was in that job to do journalism. I felt, especially as an editor, I was trying to protect the publication of its integrity. And I felt like I couldn't do that if we were going to be afraid of touching certain subjects for fear of giving offense, particularly to somebody in elected office. And so I resigned, and then I decided to write about it and wrote an article for Politico describing this just because of the reason you just said, where it's often the case that this is an intimidation tactic. You go after the bigger targets, and then the smaller targets just police themselves and say, we can't afford to take on this fight.
So your story for Politico, this had a great headline, quote, "My bosses were afraid of crossing Trump, so I quit." That's like a rallying cry kind of headline. What kind of reaction did that piece get?
It got more reaction than anything I've ever written, personally. I received, I didn't keep track, but I don't know, hundreds of emails and texts, which for me was unusual. A lot from people I knew, a lot from people I hadn't heard from for years, but a lot from people I didn't know at all, who I think appreciated this, certainly the way I framed it was, it sounds self-serving to say, but that I was standing up for basic journalistic values. And there's a hunger for that. And we are in a moment where we are seeing large institutions capitulating to this president. And so for a little nobody like myself to take a public stand was very much applauded. So I said I got the most response of anything I've written. I've certainly got the most positive response. So it was all positive. People welcomed what I wrote.
There wasn't any sort of, hey, you're taking their money. You should have just followed what they told you to do. Or, there wasn't that backlash to the positive response.
I did see one of my friends put it on Facebook, and one of his friends commented, sounds like he wasn't doing his job as editor. So there's always this sense that, the media is biased and so forth. And the thing about free speech, though, that's always been a free pass. Like in the heyday of so-called objective journalism, where people didn't expect or even think that journalists had their own opinions or didn't worry about such things anyway, defending the First Amendment was a given. That's something you're allowed to defend. It's like the idea of voting or something like that. It's sort of a motherhood and apple pie thing. So no, there wasn't a backlash to it. And I did post on LinkedIn. I did get notes from people saying, gosh, I used to have a lot of respect for governing. Now I really question it. And I was telling those people, and I said that publicly as well, that I'm sure, the editor who followed me, somebody who worked for me, is very good, very honest journalist. And I'm sure essentially everything they produce will be good and important. Having said that, for myself, I didn't feel like I could live with the knowledge that there were things we weren't publishing that would also be good for fear of giving offense.
And when you told your bosses, I'm going to quit, this is too important to me, you can't say I don't write about the First Amendment, did they try to talk you out of it?
Yeah, they did. They they said, basically, aren't we doing more good than harm? And what we're doing, I mean, there is a sense like I described in a kind of, I don't want to say cynical way, what they do in terms of linking government officials and people selling things to government. There really is, it's a small enough company. There is a sense of mission. The slogan is making government better. I think they really believe that again, there are not that many people paying attention to state and local governments. Most states, most cities, most counties end up having pretty much the same problems. And our bread and butter was saying, here's a place that really addressed this. Here's a city that brought down its homeless population. Here's a city that has managed to get more people back on public transit after the pandemic, etc. So this was how the argument was framed to me, that the mission was so important that it couldn't be risked by us being shut down. And I counter that I have a mission as well as a journalist, which is to tell the truth as I know it.
Do you think it helps or hurts your hireability that you just put this all out there in Politico? Like now, if you Google your name, this essay comes right up. Do you think that's like, yeah, this is this truth-telling journalist. This is somebody who stands for the First Amendment. Or do you think a corporate boss is going to look at that and go, oh boy, I can't have this in the age of Trump?
Yeah, I wish I knew the answer to that question.
This is still very new.
Yeah, this is all recent. And yeah, I've been out of work for a month now. And yeah, journalism is not a robust industry. So I certainly had friends and family members say, oh, people are going to see this article. They're just snatch you right up. And, but yeah, I could absolutely see it being the other way, which is people don't like troublemakers. And I don't think of myself as one. But like I say, this is now the first thing that comes up for me. So whether people will find it admirable or think that I'm, just a troublemaker, that I don't know.
But that was a price you were willing to pay.
I definitely quit this job knowing it could end my career in journalism.
On top of journalism being in a free fall in many quarters of the industry, you've got another potential strike against you. And that strike is that you live in St. Louis. Like, let's be honest, St. Louis is not where the big national publications go to find their talent. And I find a lot of jobs say, okay, we're willing to have people work remotely, but we want you to be in Chicago or be in DC or be in New York. You have to be at one of our hubs. Was that something that also crossed your mind? Like, on top of the fact that I could be a pariah, I'm also a pariah in Missouri.
You had me on to cheer me up. What they're saying.
We'll get to the cheerful part, I promise.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I'm in the wrong industry. I'm at the wrong age, and I'm in the wrong city. So, it's just a fact that as journalism has shrunk, it has consolidated into 3 cities, primarily New York, Washington, and Los Angeles. And I don't know the current percentages, but I know it's much higher than it used to be, that the major media markets are dominating print because with so many publications now being national websites or things like that. I wish I knew the current number. I read a couple of years ago that 10% of newspaper reporters now work for the New York Times. It's
Wow.
probably higher now.
Yeah.
So yeah, it used to be you could have a career, certainly in a city the size of St. Louis, where you would just be with the Post-Dispatch or St. Louis Public Radio or St. Louis Magazine. And obviously there are still people doing it, but it's not anywhere near the numbers there used to be. And there are definitely way more remote jobs than there were 10 years ago. But some of them are restrictive in terms of people wanting you to be in a hub. There was an opening right when I quit. I saw the Washington Post was hiring a Midwest correspondent, and it did say we would expect you to live in Chicago or Detroit. I'd like to think if I'd been a serious candidate, they might have recognized that St. Louis was part of the Midwest, but never got to that. But anyway, yeah, it's definitely true that um, St. Louis, Milwaukee, Cleveland, cities of this size are not part of the media mix in a way they were 20 years ago.
Unbeknownst to a lot of us in the St. Louis media industry, and I'm sure unbeknownst to a lot of people who read governing, here you were editing this publication from St. Louis, doing it for more than a decade. Do you feel like that gave you a good perspective for what you were trying to cover, that you weren't living in DC, you weren't in that bubble?
For sure. As somebody covering states, it was always a pet peeve that when I would pitch stories to national publications, they'd say, well, who cares about what's happening in Ohio or Missouri or Alabama or California? Even as they're covering every incremental lack of movement in Congress. The Washington press corps is provincial, like all small societies are provincial. Every year, the National Government Association would have a meeting in Washington, and the national reporters would come and ask, who's running for president? Or they would write that governors are important because they have a role in redistricting, which happens once every 10 years. And, governors have to sit there like the Maytag repairman for 10 years waiting for redistricting to happen, as though they're not running schools, the highway department, the National Guard, et cetera, in their own states. So yeah, there definitely is a blind spot. And I was working for NPR from St. Louis. For a year, I was on the foreign desk, and I like to joke that I was the only reporter covering the Arab Spring from St. Louis. I don't know that for a fact, but I'm guessing it's true.
I'm guessing that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I was on a call with people at NPR, and they had fired Juan Williams, who been, a star at NPR, but he made some comments appearing on Fox that were seen as too opinionated and to question his objectivity as journalist, etc. Even as Nina Totenberg was having dinner with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, as we later found out. But anyway, and somebody in the meeting said, what are people in St. Louis saying about Juan Williams being fired? And I think I said, are you high? But yeah, my neighbor who sells paint at Home Depot is not talking about NPR firing Juan Williams.
And yet everyone in the bubble, that was the biggest story. And as a media person myself, I remember having a strong opinion on that story. And it felt like for those of us in the industry, it was the most important thing.
Yeah, if you live in Washington, D.C., the Cardinals are the chair of the appropriation subcommittees. Here, Cardinals, I believe, has a different meaning. Haven't quite caught on.
What do you think it will take for the people who are running these current media companies to understand, there's this vast swath of America that you and I are just this tiny little dot within. Do you think there ever will be sort of this understanding of that in our lifetime?
I think it actually has improved for a couple of reasons. One is the pandemic, when people were very much looking to governors for information about what's happening in the early days of the pandemic. And Andrew Cuomo, who's now much derided, became a media star himself, and other governors within their states. They didn't all have brothers co-hosting them on CNN all the time. But anyway.
But like Ron DeSantis, he became the flip side star. Like, I'm opening the whole state,
Yeah, so governors raised their profile from the pandemic, both the public health approach and the backlash approach, for want of better shorthands. And then the Dobbs decision in 2022, where the Supreme Court said Roe v. Wade had been wrongly decided and there was no no right under the U.S. Constitution to abortion. And as we've seen since, abortion has become a state by state fight. There have been, I don't know the numbers, but Missouri is one of about 10 or so states where there have been ballot initiatives to put abortion rights into the state constitution. Of course, there have been restrictions at the state level as well. So there is more understanding that even as Congress is basically inactive, and in fact took a month off during the shutdown, at least the House did, that there is a lot of activity in the states. And, we are a politically divided nation, as we know, and this has led to primarily gridlock in Washington, but it's led to tremendous amounts of activity with red states and blue states doing exactly opposite things, but accomplishing a lot in terms of policy changes.
I love this. Like, you've just made this really good defense of state and local government that I wish more people would pay attention to. But as you say, maybe the tide is turning even nationally. And I want to bring this back to your career here, because I don't mean to be a doomsayer about this. I think somebody with your skill sets, I think you're going to be just fine. I think somebody is going to snap you up. But I wonder, like, as you're sort of now, it's been a month and like the dust has kind of settled a little bit. Do you have any regrets?
No, I don't regret it at all. For me, it was a clear, bright line, and I just couldn't. To me, there was no choice. And of course I thought about it. I thought about the loss of income, and the loss of a job is also something to do and feel productive about, and so forth. But I mainly thought about the money. And anyway, yeah, I don't know if I'll get an equivalent job or make the same kind of money. And I don't know, maybe it's my age. If we put enough money in our 529, our kid will be okay going through college, which he's at now, and not too far off from retirement. But, my wife found it very morbid that I did say I should collate all the laudatory emails and texts I'd gotten so that my kid would have material for his eulogy. And I guess that is a morbid joke, but anyway, I think this is one of those things where I don't know what I'll be thinking about on my deathbed other than pain relievers, but I think this is something I'll be proud of, that I made what was for me the right choice.
Well, Alan Greenblatt, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and we wish you the best of luck as you figure out what that next move is going to be.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Alan Greenblatt was the editor of Governing until last month. Now, in just a moment, we'll hear from St. Louis Magazine staff writer Ryan Krull with the closer. But first, just a word from our sponsor. St. Louis Magazine's newest weekly newsletter launches this week. It's focused on Chesterfield, with news from municipal government, businesses, community events, and more. Know someone who cares about Chesterfield? Let them know they can sign up for free at stlmag.com/newsletters. Now, St. Louis Magazine launched its weekly Clayton newsletter last month, and I'm going to tell you, it's already become a must-read for me. Expect the same with the Chesterfield edition that launches this week. You can sign up at stlmag.com/newsletters. And now for the closer. An incident in South St. Louis County last year drew fierce condemnation from the NAACP. An off-duty Black St. Louis County police officer found himself in a confrontation with 3 workers on the job in a construction zone. They allegedly called the officer a racial slur and beat him up. But their lawyers suggested the officer may have been the instigator and argued that police did not follow proper procedures in responding to a scene involving their own colleague. Now, more than a year later, records are finally being released that give us some idea of what happened, although there are still a lot of questions. St. Louis Magazine staff writer Ryan Krull has been on this story, and he joins us now. Ryan, welcome.
Hey, happy to be here. This was early in the St. Louis daily tenure when this initial incident happened. So this has always kind of had a special place in my heart.
That's right. This was one of the earlier stories that you covered for St. Louis Magazine. So this happened in September 2024. Give us the quick overview. What happened that night around 10:30 p.m.?
Sure. So the one thing that everyone agrees on all sides here is that Darnell Wallace, who's an off-duty St. Louis County police officer, drove into a construction zone near the intersection of Limburg and Lime Ferry. and then a fight broke out between him and 3 construction workers. That both sides disagree on who started the fight, if there were racial overtones and that sort of thing. Wallace is black, the 3 construction workers are white, but there was definitely a fight, and the outcome of this was about 2 weeks later, the 3 construction workers were all charged with assault and kidnapping and armed criminal action.
So the St. Louis County prosecutor got involved pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And she felt there were felonies here.
Quite a few, yes. One guy in particular, Matthew Devlin, he faced a total of 6 felonies, and the other 2 guys, I think it was had 4. So it was pretty serious. They're looking at some serious consequences here. And the other kind of quirky thing that I think elevated the profile of all this, in addition to the sort of racial element, was that these construction workers all had very high profile defense attorneys. The type of defense attorneys you wouldn't necessarily think a construction worker, to be frank, could afford. So that really caught people's eyes as well.
Yeah, so these defense attorneys, I wouldn't say that they have been making a lot of noise, but they have made some court filings where they're suggesting a completely alternate view of the case than St. Louis County prosecutors.
Exactly. So sort of behind the scenes in court filings, they've been a vigorous defense of their clients. And basically the summary is that Wallace, whenever he drove into the construction zone, he was drunk. Whenever he got out of his car, there was like those airplane travel bottles of booze were like spilling out everywhere, and that he basically instigated the fight with the construction workers. So one of them just came up to say, "Hey man, what are you doing? Why are you here? You can't drive in here." He took a swing at one of the guys, missed, hit another one, and that's whenever the fight broke out.
So as an editor, one of the things that has always caught my attention about this story, I'm interested in stories where police cover up for other police. And sort of speaking to that, there seems to be no intimation that a breathalyzer was ever given to this officer, despite some of the witnesses saying they believed that he was intoxicated.
Yeah, so Devlin, who I mentioned before, his attorney, John Rogers in particular, has pointed out kind of 2 key things. One is that there was a field sobriety test given, but it was hours after police arrived on the scene.
So presumably he may have had time to sober up if indeed he was intoxicated, which again, we don't know. No one gave a breathalyzer.
Exactly. And that not only that, but some of the officers who arrived at the scene, Rogers has said, were close friends of Wallace and may have sort of skewed things in his favor.
So that's the thing that has somewhat made me skeptical of this official narrative.
Yeah.
But now you have a story at stlmag.com that speaks to the prosecutor's case. We see some things from the police report, and some things in this police report, these are very bad facts for these construction workers.
Yeah, I gotta say, I was kind of 2 minds of this. I could honestly see both cases, both sides of it pretty equally up until very recently. Yeah, whenever someone shared with me quite a bit of the police report. And in particular, there's testimony given by the construction crew foreman, and that is very much on the side of Wallace. And it really
of the police officer.
Of the off-duty police officer. It really paints in a pretty damning light some of the construction workers' actions. And basically what the foreman said, that this one guy, Devlin, he started it. He was the instigator. Wallace, by really no fault of his own, just maybe a little bit of bad driving, wound up in this construction zone. Was no clear way to get out. It's 10:30 at night. It's dark. And then he's approached by Devlin, who starts screaming at him using racial slurs, that sort of thing. And then crucially, it's Devlin who throws the proverbial first punch that starts the fight.
So this is a big deal. And this eyewitness, basically, according to his report of this guy throws down the N-word before the fight even began.
Yeah, before there's even a fight at all. Just like you said, exactly. He's really taken things from 0 to 11 just for seemingly no reason, and also seemingly for not the first time. The foreman said that this was hardly the first time that Devlin had been in an incident like this. In fact, about a year prior, he'd had like a very similar conflagration with another person who happened to be an off-duty police officer.
Wow, what are the odds?
Yeah, at a different construction site. And then at this construction site in South County, he had been yelling at passersby and throwing his hard hat around. And I forget the exact phraseology, but he said, this guy has anger issues.
So this is looking much better for prosecutors than maybe people thought even a couple weeks ago. But, as you say, there's some top defense lawyers here. We still haven't seen the complete police report. You've only been shown excerpts of the police report. I don't think this one is over yet. What is it that defense attorneys are now trying to argue that I believe will come to a head here in the next month?
Exactly. So they issued a request for quite a bit of information. They served a subpoena to the St. Louis County Police Department asking for a lot of information about Wallace, about some of the officers who were responded to the scene that night. And they're trying to sort of show evidence that perhaps there was some favoritism shown by the police officers, to one of their own. And the police department is resisting providing that information, say it would violate officers' privacy and that kind of thing. It would just be unusual to provide this much information about to hand over someone's entire personnel file. There's no, there's no indicia of wrongdoing, so there's no reason to hand it over. That's what they're arguing. So right now, the sort of case within a case is whether or not the defense will have access to all this information about the various police officers involved. And yeah, they're gonna argue about that. They've been arguing about it in court filings, but they're gonna argue about it in person in December, and that'll kind of be the next step as this case, sort of gradually works its way through the courts.
So, Ryan, I know you will be on that story. You are not going to miss that hearing in December.
I'll be there.
St. Louis Magazine staff writer Ryan Krull, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
I'm Sarah Fenske, and that's the 314 for today. You can find out more in our podcast show notes and at stlmag.com. You can also find me and Ryan every day in your inbox thanks to St. Louis Magazine's fantastic free newsletter, St. Louis Daily. It's a fresh take on St. Louis with insight and original reporting, stories like the one we just discussed. Sign up at stlmag.com/newsletters. The 314 is a production of St. Louis Magazine with audio engineering by Brendan Shanahan. I'm Sarah Fenske, and this is the 314. See you next time.